Fleming would pick and choose from his memory of people. Biffy was certainly not the physical James Bond, the Sean Connery lookalike, but he did help Fleming specifically write From Russia with Love. There is a book, a dedication in one of Fleming's novels to Bill. Thank you for your help with the next one. And that's on the flyleaf of Diamonds Are Forever, now in a private collection.
So welcome to Spybrary, to Tim Spicer. We're going to talk all about a spy who's not that well known. It's actually Biffy Dunderdale. Welcome to Spybrary, Tim.
Thank you.
So what is it about Dunderdale? How did he first get on your radar?
Well, you're absolutely right. He is not well known, and he ought to be. And I hope I've corrected that. But I wrote another book before this one called A Dangerous Enterprise. And that was the story of a group of motor gunboats based in Dartmouth during the Second World War, which, to all intents and purposes, were a naval gunboat unit, and they would go out into the Channel, disappear out of Dartmouth. In fact, they were basically hiding in plain sight. They were a group of gunboats owned directly by the Secret Intelligence Service. They had nothing to do with the Navy other than administration. And their job was to drop agents on the French coast and pick up others and bring them back, and escapers and pilots and all that sort of clandestine stuff. And one of their chief customers was one Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale. And of course, I dug into him a little bit because I needed to find out what he was up to. And he was sending agents from part of his organization across to the French coast. So there he was, Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale, a name you could not resist. So I dug a bit deeper, and then I found out that nobody had written a biography of him. And I thought, well, here's a good idea, and that's how it happened.
There is so much to unpack here. It's a marvelous biography, and I think I'd first come across him in the Keith Jeffrey book years ago on MI6, but not much since. So, and it's interesting, we just had on Professor James Crossland from Liverpool, who'd written a book on Robert Bruce Lockhart. Again, another name that I've seen around the place, but nothing really detailed on. So we're really grateful for you for writing this one. And I felt the best way to look at his life is maybe to unpack it in terms of the destination. So if we could talk about Odessa, what did he do at 17 years of age in Odessa?
Well, actually, he did something much more interesting just before that, when he was 16.
Okay.
I'll come back to that. So
Sure.
Biffy was born in Odessa. His father, Richard, was a British entrepreneur, trader, you name it, he was involved in it. Made himself a lot of money. How he got to Odessa is unclear, although his father, I think, had been hired because he was a sort of technical engineer type who worked in armaments factories. But anyway, Biffy was born there. His father was this entrepreneur. His mother was a Austro-Hungarian countess. So you can see automatically he's from a multicultural home, multilingual. He spoke 5 languages. By the time he was sort of 16, 17, he went to school there. His father probably was a sort of what I think the technical term is honorable correspondent, i.e. he was in touch with SIS or MI6. And I think he's reputed to be an agent, not in the intelligence sense, but a commercial agent for Vickers. But there is absolutely no record of him in the Vickers archives whatsoever. And I think he was just, a sort of part-timer. If he wanted to do a deal with Vickers, he would. But the point of that is that he was probably well known, as were a group of other British trading families, to one Mansfield Cumming, the founder of SIS. And I think because, as ever, the budget was tight, he would persuade these patriotic Brits to help out whenever possible. And I think that's pretty clear that that happened. Biffy Bourne went to school there. His nickname, Biffy, it reputedly comes from boxing in the Navy. It's complete rubbish. He was never really in the Navy, although he wore naval uniform from time to time and held a sort of temporary honorary commission, but it was part of his cover. And he certainly didn't have time for organised sports. And I think he learnt to be Biffy in the bars and the sort of back streets of Odessa. I said that I would tell you that he did something extraordinary when he was 16, going on 17. His father had done a deal with the Russian Imperial Navy to supply them with submarines. And these submarines had to be shipped from Canada across the Pacific to Vladivostok. And they came in kit form, and Biffy was asked by his father, told by his father probably, I want you to escort these on the Trans-Siberian Railway to St. Petersburg, where they're going to be assembled in the docks, and handed over to the Russian fleet. And bear in mind, we're coming to the point, we're just prior to the Russian Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Come back to that in a minute. So Biffy takes them across, has all sorts of adventures, gets them there, put together, and then he decides that one in particular, the Utka submarine A-22, which we also might come back to, features again in his story later, he decides to take it out for a test run, which is pretty unusual. You think, 17-year-old, but he was studying naval architecture and engineering, but so he knew a little bit about boats. But he put together a scratch crew from the dockyard, had the foresight to load the torpedo tubes, went out, submerged, and was playing with the periscope and testing all the systems, and he suddenly saw 5 German armed trawlers, which he promptly sunk, all of them. Came back into the harbour. On the way back in, they got caught in the submarine net that was supposed to stop German submarines coming in. And that was a bit tense. The oxygen was going down, and gradually the tide changed and they were swept in, popped up, surfaced. Biffy opened the hatch, probably expecting trouble. And luckily he could speak fluent Russian, and every gun in the port was aimed at them. He defused the situation. Anyway, the end of the story is that the Tsar got to hear of it. I mean, he was friends with Biffy's father, and said, well, we must give this young man a very important decoration. And there is a Russian decoration. I think it's called the Order of St. Olaf, which is a cross between a knighthood and a gallantry award. And the courtiers all said, well, you can't do that, Your Imperial Highness, because he hasn't got the precursor to it. You've got to get one before you get the other. And so the Tsar said, we'll give him both, which is why when he gets married in his naval uniform in Paris, he's sporting 2 Russian imperial decorations. So that was before he was 17. And then he starts his career working for British intelligence.
I mean, it's remarkable. You know, we often say on Spybrary, because we cover both spy fiction and spy history. And we often say in spy fact is often more stranger than spy fiction. And I always urge our authors, go read the textbooks, go read the history, because there's so much to inspire you. And this story of Biffy as a teenager almost reads like something I used to read Commando magazines and comics when I was a kid, right?
Straight out of War Picture Library.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So he got recognized there. And then what talents do you think he possessed that got him onto the radar of naval intelligence?
Well, that's sort of a bit more straightforward, really. The British. So we jump forward. We have the Russian Revolution, then we have the Russian Civil War.
Yes,
with the Whites against the Bolsheviks, and Britain decided to send expeditionary forces to support the White Russians against the Bolsheviks. One in the north, in Murmansk, I think, and certainly one in the Crimea, and a naval task force, what we call it today, I suppose, goes to Odessa. And because Biffy's father is known, I think, to Mansfield Cumming, they were given his name as a contact. And Admiral Godfrey, who was the director of Naval Intelligence, if you look in his papers and his biography, when he was a young, I suppose he would have been a lieutenant or lieutenant commander, he goes with this expedition. And it says, and we pulled alongside in Nikolaev, I think, rather than Odessa, and Mr. Dunderdale came on board with his young son, who I was to get to know in the Hitler War much later, so jumping ahead. And he was hired as an interpreter, purely and simply as an interpreter. And of course, nobody really knew he'd sunk 5 German trawlers, and there was a bit more to this young lad than just being able to translate from Russian into English and vice versa. And quite quickly, he sort of let it be known that he could do a bit more than translating. And he already had, I mean, he was an absolute natural intelligence officer because he although he might not have realized it, he had networks all over the Crimea, which he then put at the disposal, well, for himself, but at the disposal of British Naval Intelligence. And he started to write reports. And they're all, actually, all those reports are preserved in the archive in Kew. In some, well, a whole catalogue of them, every single one, and they are incredible. Having had some experience of writing intelligence reports, they range from strategic intelligence, i.e., what the communists or the Bolsheviks thought of Britain and France and the Allies, right the way down to tactical intelligence of which gun positions were linked to the fire control centre by field telephones. I mean, they are quite extraordinary. And people realize it, and you quite often see at the bottom annotated, please congratulate Sub-Lieutenant, temporary, unpaid, uncommissioned Dunderdale for his excellent report. It has been passed to the Commander-in-Chief, and there's another one that's been passed to the Director of Naval Intelligence. So you can see he's beginning to make a name for himself. And no doubt when they got back to the Admiralty in London, these reports, they were also passed to Mansfield Cumming, who took note of this young man. So that's really how he got going.
Got it. And then we move from Russia to Constantinople, now of course Istanbul. What can you share with us about some of his exploits in Constantinople?
I have to tell you one beforehand.
Go for it. Absolutely.
You will also notice from the photograph, his wedding photograph in the book, he's, as well as the 2 Russian decorations, got an MBE and 2 mentions in dispatches. He got the mentions for the intelligence reports, but you remember I mentioned the submarine, Utka A-22.
Yes.
He got wind during his time writing these reports that there was going to be a Bolshevik mutiny on board, and they were going to basically overpower the officers and throw them over the side, probably with a length of chain attached to their ankles. So Biffy goes on board, tells the captain, and between them they suppress the mutiny. And I think there's a very marvellous sort of typical British understatement in the report. And some blood was shed, for which he gets an MBE.
Yes.
And his connection then, so he comes back to go to an investiture in about, I think, 1920 or early 21. He gets given his MBE and he gets the sort of tap on the shoulder. Will you go and see this funny chap called Cumming in a house in Kensington, where SIS had moved to? And he's formally recruited then. And then he goes to Istanbul.
Right.
Now, the reason he goes to Istanbul is because the Russian Civil War is over and there's a huge expatriate white Russian community in Istanbul. And indeed, some of the trading families had moved there as well. So it had become a sort of center of intelligence interest, not only against the Bolsheviks, but at this time there was the rise of the Turkish nationalists against the Sultan, Kemal Ataturk. So there were 2 strands that we, GB, were interested in. And Biffy spoke all the languages. Spoke Turkish, he spoke Russian, and he knew a great deal of people. So he was immediately set to work in the Istanbul station. His first job was not particularly significant from an intelligence perspective, but quite glamorous. He had to pay off the Sultan's harem with gold sovereigns and make sure all the British ladies that were working there did not appear on the front page of the Daily Mail or whatever.
Brilliant.
And he continued his penetration operations, his recruitment. He ran some agents. There's some quite good pieces about Biffy in Constantinople in the Keith Jeffrey book,
Yes.
which was actually a very useful tool for me because it was rather like a Baedeker's guide. And you, as you said at the beginning, Biffy appears from time to time, but there's no sort of joined up story. But
Yes.
you can take back bearings and find out what he was up to. Um, he There's one unfortunate story in Constantinople, Istanbul, where he was asked to attend the disbandment parade of the 10th Battalion, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, who were a wartime incremental battalion. They were being disbanded and sent home. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers always, wherever they go, have a mascot called the
Mm.
regimental goat. And the goat is either given to them by the monarch, but by the time you're the 10th Battalion, you probably bought one locally in the souk. And at the disbandment parade, the goat was on parade. Biffy was there in his full dress naval uniform. At the end of the parade, he jumps in his car, puts it into gear, thinks it's in first gear. In fact, it's reverse, and he runs over and kills the goat. At
Wow.
which point he says, I will never, ever drive a car again, which he didn't, ever. So he's a very interesting chap.
Very. I mean, it's almost like if you could create the perfect spy, it would be Biffy Dunderdale from what you're sharing with us. And, I think what I got out of your book, he was very good at building trust with people and building his networks and building his connections. And would you say that that was his biggest trait?
Although he was flamboyant, and all this stuff we talk about is sort of more James Bond than Smiley,
Yes.
he was very sociable, charming. He got along with people. People liked him instinctively. People trusted him, and of course, that is a very useful skill if you're an intelligence officer and you want to recruit people. You can't recruit them if you can't get alongside them,
Yes.
or you can't engage with them. And he was what I think is referred to as a maven. He collected people, and people gravitated towards him. And of course, underneath this bonhomie and bon vivant exterior, there was an absolutely razor sharp intelligence officer. So he would get alongside people and recruit them or exploit them or do what you're supposed to do.
And we'll talk about it more as we go through the rest of his life. But what do you think his principal motivation was in working for the British?
I think he was just. I think undoubtedly he was a patriot. I mean, he was a British citizen. He happened to find himself in a very interesting part of the world at a very interesting time, and he was an adventurer. There's no doubt about that. If you sinking ships when you're 16 or 17, and I think being an intelligence officer in that period of time, up to and including the Second World War and the early part of the Cold War, called for those quite adventurous or even aggressive traits, as well as this ability to engage with people and recruit them, persuade them to do what you wanted to do. So I think he just thought this could be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, there was two thoughts I had as I was reading the book. Was one, thank God he's working for us, the British, not the opposition, and then also, thank God he didn't turn to a life of crime because
He'd been good at it.
Oh.
Well, he did describe his career much later in life, when he was well retired. Although, did he really retire? As 40 years of licensed thuggery.
Yes.
And I thought, well, that sums it up. Although he didn't, he was. People always sort of say, well, he was a model for James Bond. It's not true. We might come to that later,
Yes.
but he did say he never really killed anybody that he knew of. Although once he was asked to push somebody off the cross channel ferry, but they weren't there.
Wow. All right. Well, let's dig into more of his intriguing story. So we've got this teenage submarine commander turned master spy, already making waves in the world of espionage. Tell us about Dunderdale's next stop, which is Paris.
And I think Paris was really the high spot of his career, in terms of what he was able to achieve over a considerable period of time. He went there in 1926, aged 26 or nearly 27, and he which in itself was unusual. If you think about it, he'd had one posting. He'd obviously had his adventures in the Crimea, but he was made the head of station in Paris, or one of a couple of stations. And his primary job, and I think primarily because of his language skills, was to get alongside the Deuxième Bureau, the French intelligence service, and become best mates with them, which was very useful to Great Britain because they were about 5 times the size of SIS and had 5 times the budget, and they were Europeans, so they were plugged in to not only the Bolshevik threat, but they were attuned, not quite when Biffy went there, but very soon afterwards, to the rise of the Nazis, and all that went on in the 30s. So he goes there, and his job is to get alongside the French, which he was absolutely brilliant at. They loved him. 3 French officers in particular, Paul Payol, Gustave Bertrand, and Louis Rivet. They were the sort of top of the Deuxième Bureau, and they all loved him. They thought he was fantastic. And he did his job. He got alongside them, got a lot of intelligence for us, but he still ran his own operations, primarily against Bolsheviks. He was then involved in quite an interesting event, the debrief of the defecting Stalin's secretary, Bezadovsky, who had escaped from Russia, gone through British Persia, and eventually found himself in Simla, northern India. And initially, London said, well, we're not really interested. He's probably a plant, just really, too difficult. And the French, on the other hand, said, yes, please, we'll have him. Get him to North Africa, and we'll get him to Marseille, and we'll get him into Paris, and we'll debrief him. So he arrives, and Biffy's invited to go to all the debriefing sessions and translate, because he's a fluent Russian speaker. And eventually London wake up and think, we may have missed a trick here, because his reports are fantastic. And so, he was developing a different side to him. He adventurous to start with, but his cover in Paris was being himself. I think he must have thought about it, and I put this in the book, but I, obviously never asked him. But I think he thought, well, if I've got to create a cover that I have to live 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, how am I going to do this? The French know who I am, but my targets, it's going to be hard to be either a journalist or a naval officer or something that he really wasn't. But what he was this very affable, social, well-off, and he could pose as a socialite who might look rather superficial in the first instance, who had a sort of junior job at the British Embassy. Well, great for that Paris at that time. Paris was a absolutely, humming place.
Yeah.
And of course, he could move in the circles that he wanted to move in, with all the the people of influence, and indeed the expatriate communities of all these places. He could recruit agents. He could keep an ear on what was going on. So, and he very quickly became a success story.
Mm-hmm.
And he got himself the biggest budget of all the SIS stations, which I think also quite important.
What were some of the threats in Paris at the time? Because obviously this is the 30s, right, leading up to World War II. So you had a lot of Soviet infiltration. There was the case of General Miller. Was it Evgeny Karl?
Yes, yeah. Exactly. You could sort of divide Paris up into the residual ongoing anti-Bolshevik stuff, support for the White Russians. But the problem with that is the White Russians were heavily, heavily penetrated by what was then they went through so many different iterations, the OGPU, whatever the KGB were at the time. And they actively wanted to not only subvert the White Russian movement, the White Russians were determined to take the war back to Russia. So it was quite volatile, but they were also on the basis things haven't changed very much with the Russians. They wanted to kill people. They would
Mm.
assassinate them on the streets of Paris, and they did. Miller being one, and so Biffy was involved in trying to work out how badly penetrated they were, what valuable intelligence he could get from them, and could he help play back agents into Bolshevik Russia, or by this time Soviet Russia. And then that sort of whole business tails off a bit because people start to switch their attention to one Adolf Hitler, and you start to get German refugees coming to Paris. So Biffy was still keeping an eye on the Bolsheviks. He was looking at German penetration. I'll come back to that in a minute because he helped the French identify a spy in their navy. Luckily, he was caught, but he was about to give all their codes to the Germans. And then, of course, there was the rise of Italian fascism, and Biffy was responsible for overseeing the threat from Italy. And then, of course, in all that, you get the Spanish Civil War. So he was quite a busy chap.
Very.
He did find time to pass on intelligence from the security service, MI5, who had intercepted a letter from this French naval officer to a Abwehr safe house, or maybe a dead drop or something in Dublin, which highlighted the fact that the French Navy had a traitor who was going to give them all the codes, which would have been tricky. Biffy helped pass the information. He was caught and executed just before the war.
Wow.
And then while he was in Paris, I think one of the things that Biffy played down later in life was his role in the Enigma business. The French, Gustave Bertrand was the head of the French equivalent of GCHQ, or Government Code and Cipher School, as it was then, the cryptology department. And he had got alongside the Poles. And the Poles were very attuned to the fact that they were the jam. They've always been the jam and the sandwich between Russia and Germany. And they had identified that the Germans had this machine called Enigma, an encryption device, which originally was commercially available. You could buy it, if you wanted to encrypt your business secrets or whatever. And then they discovered one day in the post office in Warsaw over a weekend a parcel which I think was addressed to the German embassy. And they thought, this is all very interesting. So they did a sort of surreptitious opening of the parcel and resealing it, and it had an Enigma machine. So they copied everything, they photographed it, and of course this was not commercial. This had a government encryption system in it, and of course the giveaway was the Germans wanted it back. They said, "Don't deliver the parcel. We want it back before it gets delivered." And of course, this was a green light to the Poles. Go ahead and have a look at it.
Absolutely.
Anyway, they then, to cut a long story short, they were ahead of the game with cracking Enigma. And of course, the Germans eventually realized, and then they would put another layer, another layer, another layer on it. And the story of how the Poles cracked it is very interesting, using applied mathematics, rather like Alan Turing and co. were, using mathematics to attack encryption in Bletchley Park. Eventually, Bertrand and Biffy said, look, this is really important to their respective governments. Nobody was interested. And then eventually somebody woke up and said, oh, yeah, well, actually, we would quite like share a bit of intelligence with the Poles. A meeting took place in Warsaw. The Poles said, we will give you, one to the French, one to the English, one of our copies of this thing. You take it to your respective cryptology code breakers, see what you can do. And that's how it ended up at Bletchley Park.
Incredible.
And there is a funny story of how Biffy got it to London.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So the Enigma arrives in Paris. Biffy puts in a diplomatic bag. And the way of travel from Paris to London those days was rather like Eurostar, except you went on the Golden Arrow at midday from the Gare du Nord, got on the ferry at Calais, and then got onto the other bit of the Golden Arrow, which went from Dover to Victoria. And Biffy was concerned that this is in the run-up to the war. This is literally in August 39. That the Germans would be watching certainly the train, probably the people coming on onto the ferry from the train, unusual stuff being carried, whatever, and certainly probably had agents in Dover. So Biffy goes to the Gare du Nord with all his acolytes, his henchmen, and particularly his chief of staff, Tom Green, who was a giant of a man, and gets into their compartment and says, Tom, will you walk up the train and see if there are any known hoods, any German agents that we recognise? So just so we know who's around. Tom comes back and says, well, actually, there's nobody I recognise, but except your next-door neighbour, who's sitting a few compartments further up. One Sacha Guitry, the French playwright, who was a bit of a lad with his sort of latest glamorous wife or girlfriend or both. And Biffy thinks, this is really interesting. So he, quick as a flash, goes up to Guitry's compartment and says, Sacha, I know that your baggage, that mountain of Louis Vuitton baggage you've got, is full of contraband. It'll be sent for your girlfriends in London, cognac for you. Here's the deal. I want you to hide this bag in your mountain of luggage, and I will ensure that your bags go through Dover unmolested.
Brilliant.
That's exactly how the Enigma got here.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So he was quite quick off the mark.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The other thing from his, he had a very busy World War II, and we're unable to cover all of it here on in this conversation today. But he also had a mole of some sort, didn't he? At the higher echelons of the Nazi regime.
Well, yes, I think it's quite difficult to attribute that to Biffy, the director. You're talking about Agent Knopf, I think.
Correct, yes.
And Knopf's identity, I think, has remained, and I certainly couldn't find him ever being identified properly. But he was run by the Free Polish Intelligence Service. And Biffy was the liaison officer with the Polish intelligence in London. So the reports that came via the Free Polish to Biffy's office were the Knopf reports. And Biffy passed them on. And of course, if we're decrypting Enigma and you've got a high-level human source, both complement each other, because you can see whether the source is telling you the truth or whether your decryption is correct. Now, the identity, some people have said, well, Knopf was Admiral Canaris. I personally don't believe that. I believe that Canaris was already compromised. I don't think he was the actual agent. And there's stories that Canaris went to Paris and met some of Biffy's agents. It's just not true. I just don't believe it, because he was being shadowed by the Gestapo. But I think that early on, the first Knopf reports, there is a possible deduction that he passed the information. He certainly had a Polish mistress in Switzerland. He had also, way back when Poland was about to be invaded, and I think this is proven, tipped off the Polish military attaché it was going to happen. But again, I'm not sure how well it was acted on. He certainly passed information to this lady, Helena, in Switzerland about troop movements to Italy to reinforce North Africa, or certainly almost the start of the North African campaign. There is some speculation he gave the date for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, and. But I think it's more likely that the stuff he passed directly to his mistress was passed then to the SIS station in, there were several in Switzerland, but to one of them, but also I think to Alan Dulles, who was working for the OSS. Anyway, they got back to London, and the name, whoever Knopf was, there are various candidates. Canaris is one, I don't believe it. Hans Osler, who was a senior officer in the Abwehr, but I think it was somebody in German military intelligence.
Yeah.
So he wasn't Biffy's agent directly, but Biffy passed the product to the right places.
How did Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, and Biffy know each other? How did their paths cross?
Okay. Admiral Godfrey director of Naval Intelligence during the war, was the same Godfrey who'd met Biffy as a young lad in Nikolaev. Fleming worked for Godfrey. Godfrey and Fleming came on a tour of inspection to Paris in 1939. And, well, I mean, the beginning of 39, looking at what preparations there might be for war, for stay-behind parties, etc. But nobody knew how quickly we were going to be kicked out of France. And they met on several occasions. Fleming and Biffy hit it off, became friends, and then during the course of the sort of scramble to get out of France in 1940, Fleming was there ostensibly trying to get alongside Admiral Darlan, the French naval commander, but also he spent time with Biffy, helping him close down the station, booby trapping his safe, doing all the sort of James Bond type stuff. They get evacuated. Fleming then becomes a sort of helper to evacuate all sorts of people. Not Biffy, but Biffy's station. Biffy was told in no uncertain terms by Stuart Menzies, the C at the time, you will get out because, and the implication is because you know the Enigma secret. This is really important. You cannot be captured. Now, whether that implied that if we can't get you out, we might knock you off, unstated.
Yes.
Completely surmised, or people have said that to me, but not. He got out anyway. And then the first person that he had lunch with when he got back to London in 1940, in June 1940, was Ian Fleming. So they were mates, and they were mates throughout the war. And Fleming collected interesting people and information. And he is on record as saying that James Bond was made up. He was a made-up character. He's not based on one person. But Biffy certainly was in the mix. There are probably half a dozen people you could tick off as, oh yeah, he was a role model for James Bond, etc., etc. And I think Fleming would pick and choose from his memory of people. Biffy was certainly not the physical James Bond, the Sean Connery lookalike, but he did help Fleming specifically write From Russia with Love. There is a book, a dedication in one of Fleming's novels to Bill. Thank you for your help with the next one. And that's on the flyleaf of Diamonds Are Forever, now in a private collection. And so I investigated that a bit. And of course, the sort of guts of the story of From Russia with Love are collecting a coding machine, the Lector rather than the Enigma, from a defector, a Russian defector in Istanbul, and going on a train with the encoding machine. So the basic premise is there from the Enigma story. And then also, if you read carefully, there are things like a photograph on the head of station's desk in Istanbul with a chap in a naval uniform with an MB and 2 mentions in dispatches, exactly what Biffy had, and so on and so forth. And the inscription from Fleming is pretty good proof that he helped him out.
Yeah.
But he is not the role model for James Bond.
It's a composite, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. No, I would agree with you on that. So when did Dunderdale retire from the intelligence service?
Well, his official retirement date was in 1959, which is exactly right, when he was age 60. There was a purge after. There were 3 sort of debarques within SIS post-war. One was the whole clandestine insertion of paramilitary teams behind the Iron Curtain by boat, which was like the gunboats I wrote about. Biffy was certainly involved in that. But unfortunately, his department, which was then called Controller, or he was called Controller Special Liaison, had to pass all those operations past Section 5 of SIS, which happened to be run by Kim Philby. So they were all blown immediately. None of them survived, I don't think. And then there was Suez and Buster Crabbe and a series of sort of hiccups where they tried. Dick White was brought in from the security service to basically clean up SIS. And he really had it in for what were called the robber barons, people like Biffy, who had a good war. They were pretty buccaneering. Sort of approach that wouldn't necessarily go down well in post-war intelligence service. But Biffy survived. Some of the others didn't. They were given early retirement. Biffy was not put out to grass or given a sinecure job. He retired quite normally, age 60. So that was that. But then I discovered a letter from John Godfrey again, who said, "Dear Biffy," was the effect, "Dear Biffy, I thought I'd write to you on just to say that I know in our business quite often you don't get the recognition you deserve, and it was marvellous of you to carry on working after your retirement date." So I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. And then I found out that Biffy'd gone to live in America, married a rich American widow, and continued to lead quite a nice life, keeping in touch with his wartime friends, OSS and the new CIA. So my theory is, and obviously I can't prove it, but I think it's a pretty strong case, that Biffy retired, but he kept in touch and was asked, probably by Dick White, and maybe others in the British government, to go to America. If you're going to America, we'd like you to try and steady the ship,
Yeah.
because SIS were not well thought of by the CIA at that time. We'd had Philby, we'd had Burgess McLean, and. So I think he was asked to go and be a steadier of the ship,
Yeah.
calm the waters, tell them we're not so bad, use your wartime friends and connections, which he did. And I think he was quite successful.
I agree, and with the Polish connection we talked about with Enigma, you think today keeping in touch with people is very easy. You and I are talking across the Atlantic right now, for instance, but back then it's incredible to me how they were able to keep up those connections and networks.
Well, I think, yeah, effort, personal contact. I mean, I get to talking about how we're communicating. If you think about Biffy's life, his lifetime spanned before the turn of the century, 20th century, saw the First World War, the Russian Revolution, Second World War, Cold War, and he died the same year that Saddam invaded Kuwait first time. So if you think about that span of history, it's quite impressive. The things that go with it, the technology, our ability to communicate, and he was fascinated by communications generally. I mean, there's a great story that one of his step grandchildren told me. He would go to Biffy's apartment to see him with his girlfriend, who was quite glamorous, and Biffy immediately sort of made a beeline for her. But then he got much more interested in his portable. Um, I don't know if many of your listeners will remember a portable CD player.
Yes.
Really, really fantastic piece of technology. You could walk around with your CD stuffed in this thing. And Biffy saw it and said, "What's that?" And Anthony, his step grandson, said, "Well, it's a CD player." And Biffy said, "Well, what's a CD?" And he then had to explain. He said, "Well, give it to me." And he started to take it to bits. No, don't take it to bits.
Yeah.
It's expensive. You'll break it. And what Biffy was really interested in was how the encryption worked, or the decryption worked, for this machine to read this piece of plastic and produce music.
Yeah. Yeah. Incredible.
He was absolutely obsessed with that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to be respectful of your time, Tim. So my final question for you is, what do you hope readers take away from the book?
Well, I hope they enjoy it. I hope they understand that there were people like Biffy protecting not only Great Britain, but in his case, France, America, and he retained that role to the end of his life. But I think the important thing is that I think, and I said it when I launched the book in London, people need to remember that people like Biffy nowadays, not quite as flamboyant, probably, operating under much more difficult circumstances with modern technology, face identification, all the sort of stuff that Biffy never had to contend with. But they're out there still protecting us. And they go on, quite a lot of them go unsung.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
necessarily unrewarded, but they're unsung for very good reason. But they're still there.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I was very fortunate over the summer to be invited for lunch at the Special Forces Club. And I looked around at all the photographs in the wall. Of course, no pictures or anything there verboten, but amazing to see all the different players of the different eras that many, unfortunately, put their lives on the line for the country. It's very humbling.
Yeah, very much so.
Very humbling indeed.
Well, they're still out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tim, thanks for sharing a bit more about the book. Thank you for writing the book. I really enjoy it. Like I say, with Biffy and then with Robert Bruce Lockhart, these stars of the past that are almost like ghosts today. That we don't think about them as much because yours is the first memoir of Dunderdale, isn't it?
That's right. And you used the word ghost. I mean, I think I described him in the introduction. He was like a ghost that you sort of see this apparition flitting across out of the corner of your eye. You can never really pin him down.
Yeah.
And that's what Biffy was like.
Absolutely. You can buy a copy of the book over our show notes. You can find that at spybrary.com. It is Spybrary approved. We recommend it. Tim, thank you for coming on to the show and sharing more with us today.
Great, Shane. Thanks very much.